And welcome to Handmade Hero, show where we code a complete game live on stream. We are kind of at a fun point in the project, at least I've been having a lot of fun with it. We're sort of at that point where all of our design decisions are kind of coming together, and you can kind of see how everything is supposed to interrelate. Like, a lot of the exploratory stuff we did is now resolving in a good way. And so, we're able to just get a lot of stuff right. I don't know what the better way to look at it is. We're able to kind of get to the point where we're like, oh, okay, we see exactly how assets should be managed now, or we see exactly how this can be done in a simple, nice, clean way. We don't have to worry about it anymore, blah, blah, blah. Oops, did I launch that twice? I did. Don't ask me why. There we go. And so it's pretty exciting because really what, the place that we find ourselves in is just this really kind of nice open field where we can say, look, anything that we go spend time on will probably yield some really good fruit right away, right? We're in good shape there. And so I think what I want to do today is just kind of finish up some of the stuff we're doing. I'm going to finally go, I want to peg these guys to the corners of the screen. I've been talking about many times. You notice how our debug stuff doesn't peg properly to the corner of the screen like it should. You know what I mean? And so I think I might go play around just real quickly with that today. Just make these things work a little bit more the way that I might want them to. So that's one thing that I think I would like to do. The other thing I would like to do is so we played a little bit with the camera, making it a little bit less perspective-y, just to let the 2D art stuff work a little bit better. I think now is a time to go really harp on that camera code. So that is another thing big on the table. And then finally, and the thing that maybe will take up a fair bit of today, because I don't know that I want to start on the camera code stuff, but we actually have all the stuff in here for editing alignment points. We need to do a little bit of grunt work to save those out. It's trivial for us to implement saving back to the HHA. In fact, we don't even have to implement it. It's literally just a call that says, hey, resave this file. So that's a no-brainer, but the more difficult part, well, it's not really difficult, but the more work-intensive part is we have to go make a backing store for those that we can consider an authoritative file. So in other words, something that's like a text file that we can put aside the PNGs and consider it like canonical data for Handmade Hero, so that we can say this text file describes the alignment points that we marked up on this thing, so that if we ever want to completely delete the HHAs for this in their entirety, so they're just gone, there's no more HHAs, if we ever want to do that, we can, and we can still rebuild the entire Handmade Hero assets packaged together with the metadata, can all be built again from source. So we're just trying to close that loop, because if we just save them back to the HHAs, we could consider those HHAs authoritative, but then it makes it a lot harder to, store in a permanent archival format. Everyone understands text files. Source code control understands text files. They're easy to verify visually, or, restore if they get broken. So, it just seems like a better idea to have that backing store there. That's really all, all there is to it. So, we'll stretch first. Very important. And then we'll get to work on some of these things. So maybe what I'll do at the outset is, again, just maybe clean up some of that debugging stuff a little bit. Make that a little clearer. One of the things that I'm not sure how I want to do here is we had some lighting test stuff in here before. You can see I'm like pressing some keys right now, for example, and changing lighting, all around there. I think we want to stop, now that I've got more interface stuff, I think maybe we want to go get our interface story together, our developer interface story together, bind our F keys to something that makes sense, and put the debug system and the editor together in some way, in that, like, make it be so you hit F1 to do editing, F2 to do debug, or whatever. So it's like, it just makes some more solid sense. That's mostly all I want to do there. And then get these things pegged properly when you turn them on. Get those pegged properly to the top of the screen. So I would like something like that to happen. And so like, let's just get that going, because it's been annoying me and I really don't want it to keep annoying me. All right. So let's suppose that in the world today, that we want to more centralize that handling of the, pressing the F1, F2, whatever that is. So in here, in Handmade Game Editor, or in-game editor, like, the way that this stuff works is you can, when you hit a key, it's going to set this editor mode, and like, that mode that we set is just kind of ad hoc right now. So, edit mode underscore, you can kind of see where that's happening. Inside begin hit test, it looks to see whether you push one of those keys and then sets that up. And, again, that I kind of feel like we want this to be handled in a more centralized fashion. I don't really know how that should happen. It's kind of a little confusing, certainly, because I haven't really thought through where that sort of stuff should happen. But I think we want something a little bit more, like in this code. This is our main game, just, central nexus, where we actually like put stuff out to the debug system and all that sort of thing. So it kind of feels to me more like, that should probably happen inside, excuse me, inside this general process here, right? Like, that seems like more what we would want to do. And so I think here it'd be where we would want to have the ability to have the fast F key access, where we could say, all right, whatever the F keys are that you press, they can yield various results, right? And some of those results might be things that the debug system looks at. Some of those might not be, but I may want to kind of centralize that dev mode, you know what I mean? And so what I'm thinking just in my head about how, how that might come together is, rather than having the editor have that in there, maybe this is actually just like a more broad concept. So maybe this is like a dev mode, and the dev modes are actually things that span across multiple systems. So I can be in one of n dev modes, and depending on which dev mode I'm in, I may get an editor running, or I may get a debug system running. But generally speaking, since those systems kind of want to monopolize the user interface at that point, potentially, I'm thinking maybe that's how we arbitrate that aspect. So rather than forcing all of those systems to tie together through the same UI, which I don't really think I want to do, because I kind of want the flexibility to have different things completely take over the UI, potentially, depending on the circumstances. Rather than harmonizing all of those, I think what I'd rather do is have that dev mode be responsible for who gets to do which of those things. You know what I mean? And it can still be very ad hoc. This is developer-specific code. It doesn't have to be super polished or anything, but I think that's roughly what I want to go with. And so, we'll have the asset editing stuff in there as one way things could happen. We could have like profiling be another example. We could have settings be another one. That sort of stuff. So these can actually be quick ways of accessing basic elements of the debug UI as well as the editing UI. Yeah, I mean, that seems pretty good to me. And we could make it so that, yeah, like, you know, you push F1 and you get none. You know, maybe we have like something like this. I don't know. You know what I'm saying? So something like that seems pretty good to me. I might say that this would go a little bit more like this. So maybe this is an F1. This actually starts maybe on F5 through F6, F7. I don't really know necessarily how I'd want that to go. Something like this. Right, something where I can kind of have different types of stuff that we're doing there. I don't know if we actually have. I mean, if we look at what's in there now, most of it's largely useless. You know, we've got simple ways of setting some of these things, but I feel like these can be expressed better than they're being expressed now as well. You know, all this stuff could be expressed better. We don't have software renderer still in there. Yeah, so like a lot of this stuff is just old vestigial remains and stuff. So as we clean that up and make it actually more useful in the modern context, and you know, we've got our lighting test on here, which is sort of a separate line of things. It just seems to me like this stuff can get improved, and we can make this better. Right? All right. So I'm going to proceed with this, and we'll see where we get with it. Again, this is just trying to improve that system, make it a little bit more useful to me. So what I want to do here is if the person presses F1, then they just clear, you know, they're not in a dev mode. So F1 is the way of getting rid of the dev mode entirely. At any time, you can just hit that and it goes away. I don't want to make that the escape key, because the escape key is actually a game-related key. So I'd like that to remain free for processing by the game in an actual game setting, so that just doesn't have to ever be specially handled. It's actually just, you know, always uniformly correct. So editing assets would be on F2, or maybe F4. I don't know which one I want. We'll see. Then 3 is nothing at the moment, and 4 is nothing. So then it's 5 would be the first time we get another mode here. So then we've got, yeah, like 5, 6, 7, and 8. So we've got profiling, we've got, you know, rendering, we've got lighting, and we've got dump. And I don't really know if we're going to actually use all these, you know, who knows. This is dev mode none. And then instead of these being set on the editor, these are just going to be like a dev mode parameter that sits on the game. So what I want to do is make, again, like that central, so it's just part of the global game state that anyone can always access, because it's like a developer global overriding mode that anyone who wants to just stick some debug code into that piece of their code can switch on this variable if they wish to, and do whatever they want. And so that's intentionally not hidden. It's intentionally going to be exposed globally. And the reason for that is because I don't want it to be heavyweight operation or a routing operation to access it. I want everyone who ever wants to do anything related to it to just be able to insert that code directly. And that's actually the goal, right? So if I were to take that code now and in the in-game editor stop using the editor mode, so rather than in here saying in-game editor mode, getting rid of that and having it use the game asset mode, I'm sorry, using the game state, it means I would have to pass the game state around here, which maybe I don't necessarily want to do. So what I can do is I can mirror it into the editor if I want to. So I can put that in here. And then whenever we begin hit test, right, whenever we come in here, I can just say, well, the editor game mode is going to be equal to the game state's game mode always, right? So I'm just going to force that to be what happens, right? And we could even make that be like a thing that gets passed in here. And that's just so I don't have to pass the game state around, because I don't really want to have to make sure that that always gets passed around. The editor should be sufficient. I could link it back, but I'm not going to. So there we go. And then in here, oops, that's supposed to be dev mode. Yeah. And so everyone who's checking that needs to then respect that value. In here, we've probably got this in an order that's non-flattering. So the editor gets included first before the game state, and we would need some more centralized location for defining this stuff. That's actually not that hard to do, right? We can just put it right here, and then we should be fine. So here, I just need to take any place that was referring to the to that as an editor-specific concept. And I just need to now refer to it in sort of the more unified context, but that's it. And then in here, let's see where we're at. So the game state, this actually has to happen a little bit later, because we have to have actually initialized our game state. So, but once we have, then we can actually do that checking. So we probably want to do it somewhere here, right, like that. Once the game state is known and initialized. This needs to take the game state dev mode, again, because it gets replicated just every frame back in there. But otherwise, that's fine. All right, so now when we run, we should use the new format, which is to say F1 turns things off. You know what else I have to do is stop using that for lighting. So I now want to I'm basically going to disallow anyone else from using this stuff, so you can't actually access any of these features anymore. Now, we may still want these features to be available. So rather than literally delete the code, what I think I might do instead is just bucket them out here, so that when they, like this right here, when they are needed again, I could call something to have these be maybe tied into the interface, right? Meaning all of this stuff could actually be debug UI that actually happens, right? We could make this be available as part of the lighting, like a lighting UI feature. You know what I mean? And so, if we look at debug interface here or whatever, I could make like a kind of clickable button or something. I don't remember if we already have one of those or whatever, but now that we kind of have a better idea of how that stuff is flowing through, we could use one of these things to make like a debug button, right? So we could do like debug button, show lighting, in fact, that right there is just that we know what kind that is. That's like a debug B32, right? So that's just that. Was show lighting, what was show lighting though again? Sorry, I forgot. It's world mode show lighting, right? Yeah. So these could just be something like this. And this needs to do a little bit of clearing here. So this one actually kind of wants to know when the thing was changed. So that's a little bit more complicated. This one's actually just an S32 value. Or I guess I should say it kind of more wants to be a U32 value almost. But again, that's something that you could edit. So we could say debug. What is debug box draw depth? I don't know what kind it is. Maybe it's a U32, I'm not sure. And this again is just a B32. So all of these we could do this way, and maybe we will make something better for those. Lighting pattern, I don't remember what that is. Oh, yes I do. That was a thing that allowed us to test our ray distributions. So like, you know, we could still do it this way. This one also wants to be that way, right? So this is a debug button that you can push, and it's called like accumulation, I guess. I don't know how we want to do that exactly. I guess it's more like, hey, which one is this? Yeah, I'm not sure. So world mode test lighting accumulating. What is that doing? It's like saying we want to turn it on or off. And then I guess so I guess what we want to do here is say, look, if you swapped which one it is, it should return something so that we know we want to do that operation. So we more want to do this, like if accumulation sets to true, so the way this worked originally is if accumulating was set to true, it turned it off, so it's not accumulating, and then the accumulation count got set to 0. If you set it to accumulating true, it just set to that. So I'm guessing what we would want to do here is just say, all right, so if we're not, if you toggled it to be not accumulating, then what we would want to do is set this to 0. Otherwise, we don't have to do anything, right? I think that's my argument. So anyway, in here, this is basically like our debug lighting. And that needs to take the world mode. So we can look at re-enabling that in a little bit, but I want to make sure that we get the basics down first. So I just wanted to button that up so we didn't delete any of that functionality, just in case we want to do some stuff with that again when we move back to working on lighting a little bit more. So now, in terms of the features, like being able to hit like F1, F2, and so on, I now want to get it so that like this stuff goes away or comes back depending on which one of these buttons I'm pushing, right? And so trying to move forward on that a little bit. So I guess what we really want to do here is inside the debug system, where we're actually setting up what we're drawing. You know, we've got, and we already did this once for the lighting. So, you know, if you look at how this stuff is set up, we had like a thing called like function group. Yeah, this. So we allowed people to dump whatever they want into these various groups, and then we display them in different ways. And so, you know, if you look at what happens with that, with that function group thing, you can kind of see how these trees are added, and then they're added at like locations. And this was actually the problem, is this stuff doesn't snap right the way that I would want. And so I think really all I want to do here is create some of these, you know, here's the profile group, for example, as well. I want to create some of these variables that are going to be stratified by where they came from. So in order to select which one of these we'd be doing, like, you know, we'd go down here and we look at the function group thing. This add tree here. So rather than like how many trees do we have, I kind of just want that to be more on the F keys. You know what I mean? So I think all I really want to do is when we're doing the debug and we go through here, this stuff should be more predicated in terms of what ends up getting drawn. And in fact, yeah, so I'm kind of seeing like how this should probably come together. So maybe that's memory, right? And who knows what other stuff we want to put in here. But so I guess what I would say is this stuff here, like where we do this format string or whatever, like all of this stuff I think now kind of wants to be, you know, wants to be more systemic. So rather than making this stuff be like function info size and function info and like that sort of stuff, I think we kind of want this stuff to be handled more like the other UI, where they're not the floaty trees. We just pick which one we're doing and we go from there. So, you know, we could preserve the draw trees path, but as something you can still call to if you're in whatever mode that is. But that wouldn't be the default way of doing things, right? So instead, excuse me, so instead of having this global debug table HUD function as well, like we would just, and in fact, I guess now I think about it, we could just make that we could even make that HUD function be something that's actually determined outside. Yeah. So I'm not sure exactly how I want that part to shake out, but what I am fairly certain about here, right, is I want to have a couple different things that are going on here. So I would like to have debug profiling be one of them. I'd like to have debug rendering be one of them. I'd like to have debug lighting be one of them. And I'd like to have, you know, debug memory be one of them. And that would sort of determine which part of this tree you were actually looking at and why. I guess like maybe we don't actually need a function for it per se, but when I'm looking at what happens here, we tend to want to build like customized status strings. So I feel like that sort of stuff kind of needs to be somewhere in here, right? And so I don't know, like I feel like we're going to want functions for it because we're going to want to do other kinds of customized iteration that's, you know, maybe at least somewhat specific. And maybe the answer is that should have been done as a debug element type, and so the trees are just, you know, descriptions of what should happen. I don't know. It's pretty hard to say. How hard would that be to implement? So if we wanted to make those be non-specific, like meaning if I wanted that to just be a generic line, how hard would that be for me to implement in the debug system? Like if I wanted, so, you know, we've got these various types of things when we're actually outputting this stuff, right? We've got all this logic. You know, here's all these things you can draw. You know what I mean? So if we have all this, can't we just make a thing that's like, yeah, you know, you look here and you see, you know, last frame info or whatever. And that's actually this. So it looks trivial to actually have that happen. So maybe that's just what should happen. That just seems a lot more sensible to me. So I'm going to go ahead and say, let's go ahead and make this collapse down. So, you know, here's the last frame info, and, you know, this stuff can just be rolled into here. This is the old version of that, but here's the new version of that. So we should be able to just grab that and, you know, do it this way instead. So when we look at this piece of information here, the rest of this stuff stays the same. And then the only difference is it goes into this like temporary text buffer thing rather than, you know, into that sort of pre-created area. So that should be fine. And similarly, like the way that we're doing this thing down here, it looks like this just tallies up for a particular function what you wanted. I don't see why that couldn't also be one of these things. So like if I said this thing was function summary or something, then this I feel like would also, you know, should be able to be represented in the same way. Meaning like I don't substantively know why that wouldn't work. So like this right, printing it out the same way that we were printing out this and then calling basic text element seems like it should work, you know. You know, maybe I could even say, well, by default this says like function not found or something. I feel like that would be reasonable. So in here where we do like this, you know, global table HUD function, well, you know, these in theory have data associated with them, right? Like, you know, if I say that I've got some kind of bitmap ID or whatever, right? Then I get it out of the value of whatever the, you know, event thing was. And furthermore, I assume anyway, that, you know, if you look at what like a default value is, then you can see here, like we say, like debug event to text. So like just looking at when you have those debug events, in fact, when you look at these, right, debug event to text things, you can see them using all of this additional information, right? So like the value R32 and all that stuff. So if we were to look at this stuff, then we could easily say that one of those function summaries just has like text in it, right? So like, you know, it could just set the value string pointer to be whatever the thing was that you were actually looking for, or the name, you know, whatever the actual piece of data is that shows up in here, we could use that as the query. So in theory, you should be able to, in the debug system, it should be just like, there shouldn't be any weirdness about that. You should be able to just go ahead and grab whichever debug thing makes more sense there, right? I mean, that just, I don't know, that seems pretty basic. So anyway, I think that's what I would rather do. So rather in here than saying like, let's have this global, you know, global debug table, where did that go? So rather than looking at the global debug table and saying, well, there's only one, you know, you get one summary function, you should just be able to have as many summary functions as you want, and then where those are placed, you know, they're placed wherever they are. So that HUD function thing was probably just me screwing around. HUD function. So let's get rid of that. Like, let's just get rid of that. And then in here, excuse me, when we get one of these events, we'll just say, look, let's look for that event. It's going to have a value string pointer attached to it, and that's what you should look for. So just get that thing, right? And I suppose what we could do here is we could also say, instead of calling that function not found, what we could do too is actually print something out there. So in this case, like when we can't find it, then we could actually do a printf here and say, you know, if you asked me to print something out and I can't find it, then I'm gonna tell you. Like this. So I think that works. Don't need any of that nonsense there. So that seems good. So as far as HUD timed function, that's not going to be a thing anymore. We need to define one of these function summary things. And so what was it going to be in Handmade debug interface? So that needs to kind of go in here as a thing that you can have. And then we'll have to have a way of adding one of those, obviously. But we can do that pretty easily. So let's see. Event undeclared identifier. That's a good point. We haven't actually gotten the event at that point. I feel like the null event is something we probably just want up here. Unless that needs to get cleared every time, does it? All right, I take it back. I lied. Yeah. So I'm going to make that happen each time. And that way everyone can use that if they want to. So in this case, we've got kind of multiple versions of event happening here. And I can see why that is not fabulous. Because, yeah, we don't really want want to have two of those. Looking at events, I guess I can just call this sub event here. Like so. All right, so in theory that should all be fine, and we just need a way of actually adding those now. And so now hopefully you can also see like we don't have any lines for the start of those trees, and the reason why we don't have any lines for the start of those trees is because now we aren't printing them out there anymore, right? So when we actually look at it, you know, in the debug interface, that's just, I think that's because when we did the debug stuff originally, you know, it wasn't our finest hour, certainly. We kind of struggled exactly with how we wanted to do it, and we never really ended up at a place that was all that great. And so it tends to be more complicated than it needs to be, and it doesn't really do a lot of the stuff that you might want. And so we had sort of these like root info, function info things. I think we just want those to go away, right? And that's how we were doing it. We were basically creating a temporary buffer to write those into, and then we, you know, pointed these things at it. And that's just not a very good way to do that, right? That is not how we would actually like that to go. And so we kind of want, you know, when we create this variable link here that we were creating, we would rather have this just be when we click a thing, we know that we can expand or collapse that thing kind of separately from it. So I want to go in and see how exactly we specified this stuff. I don't know if we've actually got... Yeah, that actually looks fine. So when we create a variable link in here, you know, it has the element and then it has children. So I think that basically means that this type here can be anything that you actually wanted it to be, I believe. So if you look at what the debug element is on it, I believe this could be set to whatever you wanted. So when we do this stuff, I feel like that would work. Let's make sure it does. But basically what we want to do here is set this stuff up for success, right? So looking into this debug element, the debug type here must have been set to something. So when we have create variable link, which creates one of these sort of things that can create trees or whatever, when we do one of these things, I was curious what kind of thing it actually creates by default. And it looks like it actually creates, it doesn't put an element in there at all, right? So if it doesn't put an element in there at all, that means we could attach an element to it, I would think. And then the only question is, did we do something weird where we don't process elements on things that have children? You know what I mean? And it looks like, unfortunately, that is sort of the case. So you can see here, like when we come through can't have children of a link, it then says, well, okay, then you don't, you know, you don't do this if that's the case. And again, that seems less good, right? Because we don't really care one way or the other about, you know, we would rather just be able to draw this and also have it so that if you interact with it, it can expand the children. So I'm not sure why, you know, that is actually that way. And I also don't really know why we have the link name replicated there. Like, how often does that really have to happen? So I'm going to go on a bit of a rampage here and just try to clean this stuff up a little bit as well. I'm deleting that for now. So yeah, if we come through here, you know, we should, if I run this, you know, we'll get nominally those names placed in there, right? And that's fine. And so what I want to look for, I want to understand what's happening here. When we have this name field, like what is that name field actually doing, and is it actually necessary? So looking through where that actually gets called, You know, it looks like it's really only used inside the profiler tooltip. And I guess we replicate that name out here. But otherwise, it really isn't necessarily used. So I'm going to try this. I want to see everyone who calls that. Yeah, so this just doesn't seem necessary to me. So it looks like the reason that that's there primarily is that getting, it does a simplified extraction of the name out of whatever the parsed name field was there. And I'm assuming that the reason we were doing that is because we wanted to save that name off and not have to extract it every time. You know what I mean? Which is certainly reasonable, but again, I don't really know. I don't really know if we made that decision particularly well. So looking through here, on the top clocks list, again, it just uses that get name for the element function there, and it does that for the label for the arena occupancy, right? So it's just getting the name out of there. But most of the time, it does look like people just use the name from the actual events that are in there. And that just seems better. So what I would say is everyone who's accessing the name directly, so, I would say I don't know why this can't be that. Right? Right, that would just work, wouldn't it? And so now everybody who accesses the name field is just asking for it through that accessor. And so I think, and I could be very wrong about this, but I think what we could do there is say, all right, so get name on a debug element is actually going to be a little bit more complicated than it was before. And what we'll do is we'll actually, when we go to get the name of the thing, we can actually produce the name on the fly, potentially, if that name should be produced on the fly. That seems like a better idea, and we can look to see if, to what extent that would or won't work. But if everyone is going through get name, we can at least play around with it, is I guess what I would say. Okay. So if I wanted to make that automatically handle sort of more complex cases, where I want some of the names to be able to generate summaries instead of being named something specific, then I think what I can do is when you are calling that get name function, now I can make that be actually, I can actually have that call through to here. So, yeah, I don't know whether these things, I don't know to what extent this part actually matters all that much. but I certainly can mirror that behavior. And so what I would do here is say, let's say that in order to access this thing, when you call getName on a debug element, you actually have to pass the same things we were passing before. And maybe it thunks through to this thing, right? So in the case where the element actually does have an event structure associated with it, then we can do something more like this. For lack of something better to do. Now, in terms of what the flag should be here, I guess I'm not sure. Probably none of these things. Maybe just add value. I mean, I couldn't, yeah, I'm not really sure what I would put there, but let's say add value. And so we would just thunk through to this, and here is the part of the code that would actually do this stuff. So it would actually, it would actually do sort of the null event nonsense handling here. So this stuff where it looks to see if it can get, it looks to see whether it can get one of these pieces of information. So for example, like, this stuff here where it goes and does the debug state frames, that kind of stuff. And so I think it really just means that the getName function, all it would really need to have passed to it would be the debug state itself, like so. And then I don't know if inside here you need to get for debug event to text. I guess I don't know whether we would want to add it in here or not, but yeah, we certainly could. Like, again, this stuff really, I feel like, could be made a lot better. This is not good, and we could improve this dramatically. I'm just not sure how much of that improvement I really want to make at the immediate moment. So we could thunk through to here. We could also do something slightly different, which is to say that we, by default take whatever the name is, but then, like, if this thing, when we look at what the type is here, we can opt to do something different. You know what I mean? So, when we call getName on this thing, then maybe we don't actually ever thunk through to that, but we just handle those two kind of weird cases where we've got sort of the function summary and the last frame info. You know what I mean? So again, not really sure. I don't really like the way that looks particularly much, but it's good enough for now. So if we take a look at what happens inside the debug type last frame info, and we want that to be accessible elsewhere, we can just say, well, all right, that's something that goes in here, and maybe we continue to thunk through this way, but eventually we could unify these two things in a better way. So, we'll call the getName function there, and then we'll output it. The same would be true on function summary. So, this right here, is going to do that format string. So So we'd call get name, and maybe we pass you a buffer that you can use, but then we return it just in case we want to short circuit that process. And then we, inside the function summary type, we've got this whole thing as well. And you can kind of see how we would want to make this a lot better than it is, kind of going forwards. Buffer size, buffer, and I'm really tempted to do so, but trying to keep it to a minimum. So in here we can just patch that, and then this will overwrite sort of the default result. And it's just a hack it's just a total way to patch around what's happening rather than just rewriting the thing around it to do what it really should have done in the first place. So either of these two is then the same, meaning if you get either of those, since we now want those to be able to be selectable expansion lines, then we end up in a position where we kind of have to make this stuff happen. And so both of those are going to want to do, the debug state call, and they're going to want to have that buffer available in case they need to fill it. So those can call it that way now, and so when you get the name of the thing, it can expand the name into something more complete. And so then the question becomes, oldest stored event. I don't actually know what oldest stored event is in this case. Tell me what that was. So in here, I guess we don't really need to do the null event case. So really what we can do here is say, well, if the oldest stored event actually exists at all, then you're going to do this. Otherwise, you're not. And we can just do it that way, right? So, if eventually you got this thing, or if you didn't, then that's, off you go. And I think that's all we really need. We could do that a little bit cleaner than we do. In fact, I suppose I should do it this way. So we just switch on whether or not we got a HUD function, and we just set this to 0 first, right? And that's pretty basic. So I think that's good. Oops, that's not going to work. So I think that's pretty good. Function name. Can also default to a value. And then in here, anytime that we were previously doing that get name where we need to do a format string there, we could have a buffer that does the get name. element gets passed last. The debug state gets passed here, right? Yeah. So anyway that we, anywhere we do that, we want to actually call the get name that way. And you know, we could again like not call it in certain places if we know that we don't need to, but it's still, yeah. I mean, like I said, this is not really the way I would want to do this. You know, if we were shipping this system as a real thing, I would go and rewrite a lot of that stuff to work in a cleaner way. But at the moment, you know, throwing in a bunch of disgusting stuff here is totally fine with me because this system is not really supposed to be ever seen by an end user. And so if we want to eventually make it something that's a little bit more real, we certainly can do that. But you know, we'll rewrite it at that point, not right now. Let's see. Oops. Temp name. There we go. But that's it. So, you know, it's ugly, but at least it's, you know, simple. If you're going to do something ugly, you might as well do something simple. Ugly and complicated is worse. It's kind of why this code isn't good to begin with. So I think that should allow us to get now a more, like, anyone who wants to make one of these things be an actual type, I think now could do that. So they would be able to stick an actual type of debug event into that hierarchy and have that debug event produce the actual name. So, you know, nothing should change in the immediate sense because, excuse me, the trees in question were not created with any particular events underneath them. And so now if we wanted to create an event underneath them, so for this element, if we wanted to put into there some kind of a, you know, some kind of a frame information that actually had a stored event of a type, we could do so. Now, if we're just looking for last frame data, then in theory, this one, you can literally just change the type, and I think it works. So meaning in here, if I just change the type of this thing to be one of these, I think you're good to go at that point, right? Meaning I think that one, oops. I think that one just kind of is all you really actually needed it to do. There we go. So I think that works, although I don't actually know if a debug element is ever created for those things, to be completely honest with you. So let me just see if I may need to create an element that does that. So, you know, the variable link so yeah, like the debug variable link itself, I like that that also has a name. Like, what's the point of that? So we want that to use the name of the element for sure, right? Yeah, I mean, so I guess the problem there is it doesn't necessarily always create one of those elements, which is kind of nuts. Like, I don't know why we have to have links and elements, because since the elements themselves, I mean, I guess the idea, here is just that, like, okay, Elements are a little heavier weight because they have to have debug frames worth of stuff stored in them. Maybe. But I mean, if I'm just, looking at that, I'm like, well, why wouldn't you still want to create an element for each of those so that the variable link that links to it properly? You know what I mean? Like, I feel like you really want to force there to be an element at any given time. And the element is the thing that, stores this information because, well, I mean, you kind of want that to be true. For debug variable links doing next and previous and first child, last child, right? So, you kind of just want to then just have the element come off of it, I would think. So I kind of feel like you really want to do that and just trim the fat out of that. You know what I mean? I think that's what you want to do. And it does mean you will create dummy elements, but I think that's way better than what we were doing before, which seems like a really bad idea. And so when you create one of these variable links, I think you want to pass to it, what the element was that you were using most of the time, right? And just looking through here, like, yeah, I mean, that just seems like obviously right. So when you clone a variable link, right, in this case, it will copy the element. So really the only person is create who needs to fix what they're doing. So really create variable link is the, if you will pardon the pun, weak link. So in the places where create variable link is called, there is the element, and here there isn't, and you would want to create a synthetic element for it. Same with here, same with here, same with here. So really all of these should really just be this. This should not ever happen, right? And that should go like that. So this one here, where it does create variable link, that's going to pass this. This is not going to happen. And so all of that's fine. When you go through this process and you're doing get or create group with name and you pass the name, then when you do this checking, again, that's going to want to look to see if the group has the same element pointer, really, or an element pointer with an equivalent name is what you're actually looking for. And so I think what you want to do here is say create variable link with like a dummy element. You know what I mean? So you're gonna push that on, and you really want this. So there's an element that's just a name, that's all it does, and then that gets this code. Yeah. So I think that's all you really want here. So when you create the variable link, you create a name element here. The name element is going to be debug state name length name. You know what I mean? And so in here where you do the strings are equal test, that strings are equal test is going to use whatever that debug element itself was using. So inside the create, inside here, you would just have that temp variable which is used to figure out what the name actually was. Now, since you don't want to actually be doing expansions in here, I would say what you want to do is like actually in here say, okay, get name direct. You would want to have a way of saying in here, tell me what the name of this link would be if we weren't going to expand it at all. So if it just had to look at the most direct version of the name. And really that's just a way of saying I want to make sure it has an element. So, you know, we could also do this. And I mean, honestly, maybe it's pointless to have a variable there. Right? So I think that's more or less what we want, given, you know, in terms of making a situation that maybe isn't great into something that's at least okay. And I would love to spend some time improving this, but, you know, maybe just not today. Because I don't really want to spend more than a stream on it. And that would kind of be more getting into like, let's do a second pass for improving the debug stuff. So assuming that I want to do the get name here, we know that the link, you know, has an element there, and I can get the name of it. When we actually use that, it's this. Yeah. What is the complaint here? Oh, parent. So where is create variable link, and why was that not accepting that create variable link? Why is that not accepting what I want it to be called? Seems fine. Is it just create name element? Oh yeah. So actually it's the fact that this needs to have the debug state. So I think that's fine now. So this would be like, in here now we can create the exact things that I wanted, because now we can create arbitrary pieces of, you know, arbitrary elements that can represent anything we want, and we can put them in there, which is what I actually wanted to have happen in the first place, right? So I think that's pretty much done now. So when we want to create one of these debug elements, I'm going to look to see how we were creating those before, because to be honest with you, I have no idea, right? Like that's not creating one. Yeah, I don't even know who was ever creating these. So it looks like it literally, this is the only place that we ever did that. And here's how we were filling it out. So if we want to, like inside create name element, you know, I guess we can create one this way. So we push one of these on, it doesn't have a way of globally identifying itself. So that's just going to be 0. Same with this, like all of that stuff, it just doesn't have. And then as far as these are concerned, the name of this is going to be what it was pushed in here, right? So it's really going to be this function, and I think that's all there is. The type is going to be whatever type you ask it to be. Yeah, and that's it. It doesn't get inserted into the hash table, because you can't look these up. They're not hashed. They're not hashed by GUID because there is no GUID. And I think that's basically it. If you want to put a debug type in there, so debug element type, or what was that thing we called it? Just debug type. So if you want to put one of those in there, we can, and then you can just specify what type you wanted the thing to be. And so for things which were for things which are just sort of arbitrary, these would want to be, I guess they would want to be sort of written here as something special. So they're kind of like a debug type. They're just a name, and so by default, that is what you would say. In fact, we could, maybe even have that be sort of what would normally happen. And then if you want to make it be something else because it's got a fancy way that it wants to get at its information, then it can, and I guess, I'm not sure how we want the function summary part of things to go, like where we want to get that piece of information from, the function summary bit, because how it looks that up is kind of, I don't really know how it should be looking that up. So that's part is going to be, we're going to have to look at that a little bit more carefully. So I'm not going to touch that just yet. All right. However, this stuff can now be backported just fine. So I think, if we now sort of say, all right, that was what we're doing, then this stuff. Okay, I'll be honest with you, I don't understand what just happened there. That shouldn't have done anything. Oh, because we did actually reach in and change it. Never mind. So I think that's roughly what we wanted to do, but, again, pretty hacky. So let's see what's going on here in terms of making this. I don't know why that's unhandled. Because the type of name as a type should be fine. It doesn't like the fact that when we're interacting with this, so it looks like, I guess the reason for that is because it expects there to be events coming in for this thing, and obviously there aren't going to be events coming in for this thing, so it's not an auto-modify variable. It should be an expansion event that happens there. Like a toggle, right? And in order to push that on properly, I have to make sure I can, I have to make sure I get that part correct. But at the moment, I just want to see what was the problem with the unhandled bit. So that's actually pushing it through this path, which again, I'm not sure why it's doing that. Yeah, so So this on the can have children front, so I want to figure out what's going on there. So in here on the can have children front, yeah, that doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. So I feel like this is just dumb. That should go like this, and that should really be, does it have children, not can it have children, right? So this should just be that. So I do think this stuff could be simplified rather dramatically now. You know, just looking at that code in there, if we went through it and took a bit of a hammer and chisel to it, I think we could rather dramatically fix it. But anyway, if you look here, that's a bit weird. So it looks like can have children is evaluating to true for people who don't themselves actually have any children, which is a little confusing to me. Am I wrong about that? Right, I mean, it looks like, so that is actually getting treated as if can have children is always as if get have children is always equaling true. So I wonder, are we actually storing these as circular linked lists? We are. All right. Yeah, this code needs to get sledgehammered. Anyway, the code is not great, but it is functional, and that's something. So let's just finish off what we did want to do. And yeah. I think we came at this so reversed when we did it, you know, figuring out what was going on. It really needs a pass at the end to go, okay, now that we figured out how all this stuff is getting threaded through, and stored, like, let's actually go through and make this make more sense in terms of how we're actually, you know, using it, which we never really did, you know? So it's kind of just got too much stretching and pulling, and then it never had a part where we went through and actually tried to streamline it, so it kind of suffers from really roundabout things happening that now could just be simplified. Much like what we did with the asset system yesterday, where we just said, oh, we could clean out this whole set of things, you know, and then did. So it's just, yeah, it's unfortunate. But anyway, so now that that's working, let's go ahead and make it so that we can, again, like have a more like direct access UI for those things. So if we're looking at like the, you know, this stuff here, what I kind of want to do is just maybe get the dev modes and correspond them to the dev modes. So like maybe the way this works here is less like this and more sort of a you know, maybe we will store the root group, but maybe we also say like, okay, we've got variable links for like dev modes, and inside the, you know, the stuff in handmade.h where we store what all those dev modes are, just so we don't have to bother with that. We just say that there's a count in there. And so when we look at the dev modes, these various pieces that we want to kind of put together there can just be set up per dev mode, right? And so then all we would do is say, when we go to render this stuff, right, rather than let's go pick a particular, like let's go draw all the trees, instead what we would do is just say, when we add these trees, and actually I guess now that I think about it, yeah, oops. So sorry about that. That's not what I meant. Okay. What I meant to say was here. So instead of having the tree sentinel, maybe we just say, look, we're not going to have trees working that way anymore. Instead, what we're going to do is say there's a set of trees. They don't have like next and previous, and they don't link together. Maybe they don't even have a position. So, you know, this stuff now becomes just we're going to draw a particular variable link based on the dev mode. And so if where do we draw the trees here? Yeah, so if I look at this, right, you can see it kind of doing its thing here. I'm going to say, like, let's just, you know, and you got draw tree link. You can see it creating the layout there and then doing it. So you can see this happening. I'm going to go ahead and say, let's just forget about that. So I will, you know, we'll leave the tree sentinel in there for the moment. And then I will actually do what I said I was going to do here, which is like set up the dev mode links and set up those based on the count that there are. And then we're going to draw those directly. So inside the debug setup code, you know, rather than calling this, we'll just call this. When we create the initial layout, right, when we do, where is it? So when we do this, I guess I don't know what the group part is. So really, I just want this, right? So inside here, we would say this thunks out to a thing that draws an individual tree. And I want to kind of make it so that the move box thing is probably outside. So like it's probably something like this. You know what I'm saying? And then here it only does this part. And in fact, I don't see any use of the layout in there. So it's really more like, yeah, it's really just this. What I don't know is why we care about the tree group. I assume it's for differentiation purposes, and I suppose that's okay. It's just a pointer that we use for differentiation. So, you know, in here you can see, like, the only thing we do is we use it for that differentiation. That's it, right? And that's just so that you can store information that's dependent upon both things. So you can like expand something in one tree and not in another. So that's actually okay. I don't mind that. So we'll keep passing that down, but we won't really use it in a large extent. We will probably just kind of ignore it, right? Okay, so if I was to put in the stuff here that needs to actually happen, that looks like that. This UIP is just like, where did you want it to be? Like that. We've got the draw tree link nonsense happening here. I think that's all there is. Yeah. So this can still work as it was working if we wished it to. It just passes that UIP down this way and the group as well. And then what we can do instead of actually ever calling that, because I don't actually want to call that, and again in here we say like what the debug tree was in question. We can actually call this directly now. So instead of calling draw trees, which we're sort of saying I don't really care about anymore, instead what we're going to do is call draw tree. The debug tree is just going to be a ridiculous, like a nonsense tree that we just use for that differentiation, right? So it's not really there. And that way we can preserve the functionality of if for some reason we wanted two trees to actually happen, we could do that. And then we'll worry about what this v2 is in a second here. But then we will say whatever the dev mode links are for this particular thing. So in this case, right, we've got some set of them here. Whatever those dev mode links are, those are the things that we're actually going to use. So we're going to reach into the game state, find out what those are actually set to. And remember, we can, I think, get that. I don't remember how we were accessing that particular piece of information, but we were. It's like get game assets. Right, so you can see here from the game memory, you can get the game state out of it. So we are able to read that information without needing to know anything else. So in theory here, we should be able to actually grab the tree in question, because we can say whatever that game memory was, that we were using. So I think where we call debug end, right, we know what that is. So in debug end here, we should be allowed to do that if we wanted to. And that's where we would read that value out. So that seems fine. We can just do a check here to be like, if game state dev mode is less than array count, debug state dev mode links. We can make sure that we've got one that isn't going to be like illegal, and then we can go from there. So I think that's fine. We need to actually pass the tree here, like so. I think that's it. Yeah. And so now if we run this, we should not have any drawing from the debug system, no matter what I pick here, right? If I then go and ask it to give me one of those debug overlays, I should be able to now get it by just when we actually do our setup. So when we do like the debug init stuff, so here, by setting these things up into particular locations. So for example, I don't actually know which ones of these things we want to actually supply, but for example, if I just say that the debug state dev mode links, and I pick one of the F keys that I wanted there, so like, inside handmade.h, I just say, well, whatever was supposed to be linked to profiling, I'll set the profiling one here. So like I said, don't really know how this is supposed to work. But maybe it works like this. Who knows? But anyway, so then I've got like the dev mode links for rendering equals something, and I don't know what it would be. But then the debug state, dev mode links dev mode lighting, memory, and then maybe like just like dump. Like I said, I don't know what that is, maybe. But right now that's going to be like the root group. And then we can start reorganizing this stuff. So, you know, if we imagine we're doing something like that, you know, then like in theory, you know, I can set these to, oh, that's weird. Why is F5 cause the editor to come on? Does someone know what's going on there? Where's those F keys? I don't know why that would be doing what it's doing. That's bizarre. Don't you agree? We're setting the dev mode and, you know, we pass it down just so it knows what mode we're doing, but it's like it should always be. So, that's interesting. So it turns the editor believes itself to be in that mode when we actually hit that button. So like, you know, when we set the dev mode to dev mode profiling. But I have no idea why. So I'm interested to, I'd like to do a little stepping into there just to see what's going on, because that's a peculiar one. Inside the editor, oh, because, right. Yeah, that's actually how we wrote it. So for now, I guess we want to do it this way. And we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. All right. So I think that's fine. And then we just need to create like the correct position from it. So we'll see what happens. So it doesn't like looking at that, which I guess I can understand. So I don't know where those groups actually are. So we need to kind of get this stuff going, right? So in terms of building what interface we want here, I think what I want to do, I guess, so you can see it how we're doing like a debug data block. And then we say like, okay, here's the things that go inside the profiler, right? In terms of how we're making that go, we kind of want to here say like, look, we want you to put that inside one of our things. Like we want the ability to like specify that stuff. And so I'm trying to think of like what the best way to do that would be. Because we don't really want what I did here, which was just to do it inside this. So in terms of placing those things somewhere, I mean, I think, I guess I don't really know, but, and even this, I guess we don't really even need that anymore. So I think what we want to do here is just say, look, these dev mode links things are just when you actually when we see you ask for one of these things to go into the HUD, then it just does. I think that's all we really need to say. Probably. And I suppose we could even just make that be some way that you just set what the debug thing is set to. I don't know though. But anyway, so like if we look at what's going on here, yeah, like I want to be able to say like set this thing, this data block to be the one that's actually being used. When we go into the debug collation pass, so in here, you know, when we see the different types of data that are coming through, it seems like you could just say, well, whoever the parent is, if I say that that's somebody who gets stored to the debug state, then it is. You know, so you know what the default parent group is right here, right? And so what you could do is just say, yeah, you know, if I see one of these things, like, I could just say that. And so then the only question is like, what is the that? Like what goes in there? You know what I mean? And then you would say something like, make sense? And so in this case, I guess since we know, you know, you're allowed to do whatever you want as far as data is concerned. So, you know, you have the event here, so you should just be able to say, look, that just, all that does is set this up. So inside here, you also have a thing that's like, oh, there's that. When you encounter one of those inside here, it's just going to take whatever the dev mode value is, you know, and it's going to use it. So it'll say like, whatever the event value would have been, like this U32, it'll just say like, if that's less than how many of these we are allowed to set, then go ahead and do it. Right. So I think that's all we would really need to do for that set HUD. And so inside here, when where we actually, you know, record these things, they you know, pop through. Whenever we're doing one of these debug event records, I think that's probably it. You know what I mean? So let's see. I don't know if that's actually true, but if I wanted to make one of these for the debug system, and so it's just, all it is just that value. The debug name probably can stay what it is, and this is probably just that. And this is going to be dev, I guess, well, I guess it's still just that. No, it'd be set HUD, right? Yeah. I guess. I don't really know. So yeah, that works. So I think that means kind of the nice thing about that is the debug system doesn't really have to be aware of any of these things now. So you could just say, you know, that's rendering. That's lighting. And you know, it would just work. Right? And that's pretty cool, actually. So I think now we're mostly done with what I wanted. I think that's pretty much everything. So that's a lot more than actually what I had hoped to accomplish. I was going to just do some quick stuff, move on, but I kind of got a little bit more into it. So that actually is more than I needed, but I think that's what we want. So then all I need to do is just snap this to the upper corner, and I think we're done. So, you know, when we look at what the actual layout of this frame is, when we look at whatever the render state is, I want this to not be 0, 0. I want it to be like the upper left corner, let's say, for example. So this information, this is actually what I need it to be, and I need to be able to get what that width and height actually are. So I want this, and in order to get those two pieces of information, I would need to look at the render group, which we have, I believe. It's off of the UI though, if I'm not mistaken. So it's actually down here. And so, you know, I just want those to always be up there now. Like, I don't want them like floating around. I want to have them be what they actually are. Let me just see here. Where is render group? It's actually in the commands of render group, isn't it? Yeah, it's this. So it's actually just render command settings with, so I'm gonna just use that more directly. So now I think that's all wired up properly, and in theory we would get the correct location for our debug data. Maybe, maybe not. We'll see. There is something really weird that's going on with how we're getting the letterboxing there. Like, you'll notice the same thing happens. We should look into what it is. The same thing happens here. Like, this should be correct, and it's not. So our like transform is not quite right. If that makes sense. So this is a little bit more easy to use now too, right? So we can quickly jump to whichever one of these we're actually trying to use. And we still should be able to do the global one too, like if we want to put a thing in there that's like, go back to the weird like complete ontology one. We can also make this default to be bigger now too, so it would just by default extend down to show more of our profile at any given time. So we're getting there. We're getting there. This could also be extended to the full range of things. I'll go ahead and stop for now. But that's good. I'm glad we got that out of the way. Let me go ahead and set this to... and that way, yeah, we only get one of... And I can also make this now, which would be better too. I can make the editor UI, so instead of it being sort of blocked up against the on the middle of the screen, it can also use the UI space. Oh, that's kind of cool. So the UI space actually says what the min is. So I guess I could use that instead as well. So like, for example, here, oops. I'm not sure that that's correct. So this should really just be... Do we have any like min dim? There we go. I was gonna say this should really be this because it was being specified in a rather weird way there. But the UI space min and max there, I don't really remember how that was getting set up, but I wonder if we should just be using that. I don't really remember when UI space gets set, but I wonder if we can just use that in the thing. UI space min. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know when that gets set up. So when you begin the UI frame, it sets that up to be 0, 0 to width and height, but that's not right, is it? Because that's not where it actually starts. Like, what's going on there? Oh, it's because it's center dim. Yeah, all right, never mind. So that would work. So if that's center dim, then why doesn't this start at the top? Did I do something weird? Yeah. So it needs to be min-max, right? Like, yeah, I thought so. So this actually has to be set slightly differently. But it should be the entire thing. So I guess all right. I guess I see why I did this before. So we want the thing to go from the minimum to the minimum x plus 700 and the max y. So I did have it written right before. I was just being a little weird. So now when we do the editor, right, it should be the whole sidebar. And the weird part about that is just for some reason we have our transforms a little bit confused with how this is working. It seems like we're somehow not getting, maybe because of the title bar, we're not actually getting a properly aspect ratioed thing. So when you do the transforms, you actually get non-conformant aspect ratio. So we kind of got to go look at why that's happening. But otherwise, what that does mean is inside here, this actually is not necessary. So I kind of jumped the gun on that. So what we can do here is actually use this, where we say, this is where we want to start displaying all of our stuff. And so when we draw the tree, we'll do it that way. And that would let me no longer have to be sort of weird about how that's getting passed in. Oops, and that's already even a variable that we had, so we could have just used that directly. All right. And so those we probably want to also make switch by default there. You know what I mean? And there's that. Yeah. So this is going to be good. This is much better than it was. We've got a little bit more work to do there, but we can do some other stuff. All right, let's see what's going on here. How would you go about exposing a very object-oriented API to C without ending up in the disaster that DX12 did with their C API, especially if the API is something like a device for its central access point? I guess I don't really know. I haven't programmed DX12 myself. So I don't really know what the issues are with that. Is it really a disaster? I mean, you know, I guess I haven't looked at it. So, you know, maybe it is. Oh my lord. Yeah, all right. So fantastic. I guess what I would say is normally if you were just sane, meaning you didn't work at Microsoft on APIs, and you're like a normal human being, it's really not that bad. Like, you know, if you have an object-oriented API, and we even do this in Handmade Hero in a sense that we have plenty of things that use a particular state structure. You know, if you just have something like, you know, then, you know, just write that or whatever, and it's fine, right? I mean, there's nothing not object-oriented about this, right? I can just say, look, I want to get this device. I want to ask the device for a texture. I want to free the texture. I want to close it, right? It's just, it looks fine, right? If you just actually only put in the things you need for the code to work, then it just works. It's only if your head is filled with all of this crazy you know, modern programming nonsense that you think you would need anything more than that. I mean, that's all you need. And there's nothing non-object oriented about it. I mean, I don't need to see anything in here. This could just be an opaque handle. Right? I mean, it can be fully that, or it can be, you know, this. Right? And this API works just fine. You know, there's nothing, just sensible basic stuff can already be the same as object-oriented, you know, can follow any object-oriented principle you want where everything is hidden from the person who's calling it and you never reach inside the struct in any way, it just works, right? So it's only because people somehow think that there's something other than like generating CPU instructions that they're supposed to be doing at their day job. But you know, if you just focus on what do you actually need to write in order to get the thing to happen, then it really just works, and it doesn't have to be so crazy. But unfortunately, people think that all that complexity is somehow good, and it's not. It generates slower code, it's harder to read, it's harder to understand, harder to learn, harder to maintain, works with less languages, you know, that everything about it is bad, right? ZeriZI says, off topic, best way of moving data from disk to GPU. What I think I really want is to get a GPU map memory chunk and map my asset file right over there, assuming I'm prepared the data to be GPU friendly. What I have right now is loading from disk into memory and then either doing GL buffer subdata or map view and copy the data. How can I avoid this copy? I don't think you really can. Most of the time on Windows, unfortunately. And the reason that I say that is because since it's a heterogeneous environment in terms of the GPU, the problem that you're going to run into is that while you could probably do something sort of like what you're talking about with buffer, with like vertex and pixel, I'm sorry, vertex and buffer data, like things that will be fetched by like the vertex shader, geometry shader, things like that, in your defined format, that will work. So you probably could do something pretty close to that. Maybe on PC it's harder. But the problem is a lot of the data you're downloading is texture data. And if you're downloading texture data, the problem is that the format that the graphics card needs the texture data in is not the format that you have it in. And you might ask, why can't I just put it in the format that the GPU needs it in? And the reason is because each GPU actually needs it in a different format. So I'm a little bit out of my comfort zone really describing why this is true. So I would invite you to take this with a large grain of salt. You really need to ask someone who's a serious PC graphics programmer, like, in other words, their job is not to write all the rest of the game code. All they do all day is PC GPU work, because that is a job. It's a full-time job for multiple people at you know, AAA game companies or whatever. Texture fetches are extremely expensive graphics pipeline elements because the way in which data is processed in almost every other case is predictable and can be streamed. And to understand this, I guess the way I would point it out is, if I have a set of vertices and I'm going to draw those, they represent triangles, then the GPU pretty much knows it's going to go through these vertices and transform them, and it can transform them into a cache or a temporary buffer, or all sorts of other things like this, right? So it knows that that's going to happen, or at the very least, it can say, well, if I need to transform these vertices, I can transfer them in blocks and save the blocks and throw out blocks after I'm done with them. So I never really need to have that much gathering of those buffers most of the time, right? Not sure really how to describe it in the correct way, but point being, it's not so random access. It's fairly consistent how it's accessed. But texture data is completely different. Texture data is typically fetched completely haphazardly, right? Like, any given little piece of a triangle that happens to be visible is grabbing some random thing from some random bitmap in a random texture in a random place and getting just these 4 pixels and using them, right? And so paging that stuff in and out to like have the caching of it be coherent is like really tricky. And you're trying up through the entire pipeline to minimize the amount of time you're waiting around for textures to come in. And they're doing all kinds of crazy stuff in there. All kinds of caching, all kinds of like trying to have lots and lots of texture fetches outstanding. So there's lots and lots of like virtual threads in the thing waiting for texture fetches to come back to like complete operations. So like we're running tons of pixel pipelines in parallel and like ping-ponging between them based on who got their texture fetches back. So it's this huge deal, right? It's not simple. It's very, very complicated on the hardware side because that's where like all this time is being spent waiting for these textures, and you really have to minimize that down, right? So where this gets into the texture format issue is that while the actual like bits of a pixel are the same as you think they are, so like if you say this is an RGBA texture, then it probably is like an RGBA texture, and each pixel probably is 8 bits R, 8 bits G, 8 bits B, 8 bits A, right? That's like probably true. What's not true is that the way that you send it down, where it's just like a line, like one row of pixels and then another row of pixels and another row of pixels, that is not how it will be stored on the GPU. What will happen on the GPU is that it will have to be what's called swizzled, which is when you store pixels in some kind of a zigzag pattern. And the attempt, what you're trying to do there is, remember, caching still happens on the GPU for things like texture fetches and all that other stuff. So when you go to fetch a cache line's worth of data, so 64 bytes or something, you want the chances that that has all the pixels that you might need for that set of operations. You want the chances of that happening on one cache line to be as high as possible, which is probably not, like if it's a 64-byte cache line, let's say, it's probably not 16 pixels in a row this way. It's probably like a 4x4 block of pixels or something, right? So what the graphics card does is when you submit a texture buffer, it has to copy it anyway. It copies it out of the zigzag order and into a new order, right? Now, sometimes that happens on the GPU side, and sometimes it happens on the CPU side. And it depends on whether the GPU has an accelerated deswizzler or something in it, right? But that has to happen. And on a lot of drivers, that happens in the driver. So the driver copies it from one place to another using the swizzle pattern, and then the GPU just uploads it into the memory using the mapping aperture, right? So now you might ask, well, why can't we just always store the thing pre-swizzled, and then it could just get transferred like any other buffer data? And the answer is because the correct pattern for swizzling depends on how the memory crossbars were set up on the GPU. So when you go to fetch something, there's actually different patterns of memory depending on how the memory banks are laid out that are more or less efficient. Because remember, when you fetch from memory, it's not always a uniform kind of a fetch. If I fetch like 1 byte from each of several memory banks, I may be able to do that faster than fetching n from one data bank. Or maybe the opposite's true. Maybe fetching n from this one data bank is faster than fetching n from each one, right? And so there's all these like interleaving patterns that happen and how the memory addressing plays out. And since you care about how fast that is, the swizzle pattern needs to match the design of the cache to memory crossbar, right? Not a hardware designer. I spend no time studying that stuff, so I have no idea what the constraints are there or why they are the way they are or any of that other stuff. But what I can tell you is every graphics card has it set up differently, and so depending on the graphics card, you need a different swizzle pattern. So you can't even store your assets in a format that you've guaranteed is the right swizzle pattern for maximum performance on a particular graphics card, because each graphics card will have a different swizzle pattern that is the fastest for that. This is why, if you're on PlayStation 4 or Xbox One, you can pre-swizzle your textures because the textures are in only one fastest format. It is a known GPU with a known memory crossbar pattern, so you know that you just put them in the format that it wants swizzle pattern-wise for this one piece of hardware is always right. But that's just not true on the PC. Now, there have been attempts, like DirectX specifies a pre-swizzled pattern. The problem is they specified like one pre-swizzled pattern or something, and it's not the right one for all cards, so it's still not, it doesn't solve the problem. If everyone's standard on one swizzle pattern eventually in the future, it would solve the problem. I don't think they've done that yet, though. So you're kind of faced with that problem, and I don't have a solution for you, right? You just kind of have to deal with that. And so it may not really be a thing where you want to try to go as far as you're saying, where you just do the mem map and mem map into a GPU buffer. The other thing that I would warn you about is when you map memory into a GPU address space, you may end up in right combining memory, and you don't necessarily know if the operating system is doing the right thing with respect to how memory mapping is going to work in that case. This is a little bit more in the weeds, but when you are talking about memory that's backed by hardware, oftentimes it doesn't use the same cache right combining rules as like just regular CPU memory. As a result, reading from that memory can be incredibly expensive, way more expensive than it would be if it was regular CPU memory. So if you use some kind of an operating system operation on memory that's mapped to the GPU, you really want to make sure there's no chance that the operating system might think that it can read from that memory, because if it ever does try to read from that memory, you may be in a lot of pain, right? So I guess I would just point that out. It's not so much whether it reads or writes, it's if it does those two things together. Meaning if it writes and then reads back something from that memory, that would be really bad. Because it has to do special things because of the cache coherency with what's ever happening on the GPU. It has to do other things where it uses right combining in these ways that makes it so that reading back becomes much more expensive. That's all. So I'd be careful with that stuff. I don't have any specific recommendations because I've never tried to do what you're talking about. So it may be just fine, but I just would be careful about that. I would check to make sure it's not happening. Update the dump view spec a little. Is this clear about things? Yeah, let me take a look. The text representation uses a semicolon. This has its issues. Therefore, all element names are not allowed to use semicolon. Only elements that knows how much data they are reading can contain semicolon. Yeah, format terminology, general format, and tree view. Yeah, that's definitely clearer. I have to play with it a little and make sure I think that split out the right decisions there. But yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Meaning there just needs to be ways of saying, look, I'm dumping stuff here and I don't want to care if stuff has semicolons in it, so I can just make multiple compounds and that will just work. So that looks more like what I was saying. So oops fallacy is basically overusing inheritance. No, like I really want to emphasize the fact that the problem with object-oriented programming is like I've said it many times, is the object-oriented part. Meaning the problem is the way that you are told to think about your program is just, I think, fundamentally incorrect. And the reason for that is because a CPU doesn't have objects. It's not a thing. So it's built upon a fictitious wholly human-created artificial model rather than something that comes from what the computer actually does, which, I mean, obviously a computer is human-created, but it's there. It's the thing you're actually using. So it's actually tangible and real and has actual real answers when you look at what it's doing. Object-oriented is like a fictitious way of thinking about those things. None of the things that you talk about in object-oriented programming map to something that happens on a computer. They're all things that are just mental, imaginary things the programmer is imagining, or that the programming language imagines are true, but they are not true. It is not true that you can't access the internals of a class that you have a pointer to. You just can, right? And so object-oriented programming, the reason I don't care for it is not because of any individual part of it is bad, because usually, like, object-oriented programming doesn't really have many techniques that are part of it that didn't already exist independently of it, right? It's more about the fact that object-oriented programming is a mental paradigm that's talking about how the programmer is supposed to think about the program, and that mental paradigm is not useful. That's the problem. So it's not that inheritance is wrong, or encapsulation is wrong, or polymorphism is wrong. It's not that individual things that actually mean something in an implementation sense are somehow wrong, because nothing implementation-wise is wrong as long as it generates code, right? It's that if you follow the object-oriented programming mindset, it usually leads you to construct programs that are not well working. They don't usually accurately arrive at the simple, correct solution to a programming problem. They usually have a lot of additional things that were not necessary for the problem. And as a result, they are slower, harder to read, harder to maintain, harder to adapt to other circumstances, harder to modify, harder to optimize, right? And that's the problem. So that's really the case. Not that there's something inherently wrong with a particular technique, right? That's all I would say. And so if you want to use an object-oriented programming language and you want to use object-oriented programming features, I don't even think that's necessarily bad, right? As long as you are being clear-headed about what the code is that you're generating, and you're thinking in terms of what the actual result, how it works and what it does, and you're prioritizing that, then I think you're going to be okay, It's more a problem if you allow these fictitious constructs, which were made for various imaginary reasons, some of which may be beneficial, some of which maybe not, but without the tie back to what you were actually trying to do, which is create CPU instructions for a computer to run. You don't have a good way of determining between them. That's how you end up with this proliferation of people talking about things that are obviously not true, right? Where they'll end up talking about, oh, this code is better than this code, and you're like, why? And then they list a bunch of things that actually don't have any practical truth. They don't actually produce better code on a CPU. And so you're like, no, what you mean to say is for your imaginary world you created, which you may well believe in, but you don't have any proof that there's anything better about it, right? You're saying that you like this better. It's sort of like saying, I think this picture is prettier than this other picture, right? And that may be true for you, and beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but if you can't point to something concrete that's actually happening, then you shouldn't be advising other people to do it. Without first that disclaimer that's like, the thing I'm telling you to do is really just about my own personal aesthetic preference, And your own personal aesthetic preferences are not, that's not engineering, right? That's art. ZRI. Great answer. So is it possible to memory map a file to GPU pinned memory for non-texture data then? I think about a complex 3D model. Sounds like you can't avoid this mem copy. I agree that textures are trickier, especially if they're compressed already. I mean, so here's what I'd say. I can't think of any fundamental reason why the operating system couldn't be written such that you can overlay a GPU mapped aperture with a memory mapped file. I can't think of any reason why you couldn't do that. But as far as I'm aware, I can't think of what API gyrations you could go through to make Windows actually do that. And so I'm assuming that they haven't actually implemented that. So I would be surprised if you can get it to work, but I mean, I don't know. Like, I haven't tried it, so I'm not prepared to say. Maybe it works. But you have to understand, like, so the way a memory map file works, right, is the operating system reserves inside the memory paging table, it reserves a range that's as big as you told it to be. So you say, I want to map a gigabyte of data in this file to this to a location in memory, and it goes, okay, I'm going to reserve that location and set all those pages to be false. When you go to access one of them, it will fault and cause it to go, hey, you faulted here. Does that mean the program crashed? Oh, no. What actually was happening is they're touching a reserved part that's supposed to be mapped to a file. That's fine with me. I'll load it in from the file and then allow that thread to resume, right? That's what it's going to do. So in order to have something that was both mapped to the GPU and mapped to a file, you would have to have the operating system be able to set up the page table such that it's set in the page table. Not only is this set to be backed by the file, so when there's a fault, I read from the file, but it's also set to be mapped on the PCI bus aperture out to something that's in GPU memory. Maybe it can do that, maybe it can't. Like I said, I've never thought about that, so I've never tried it. Go nuts. You know, I mean, I don't know. But yeah, I would point out compression is relevant here. It's unlikely that you're going to store all of your data in at least in a professional high-end setting. You're not going to store mesh data probably raw. You probably will have compressed it. And then so it doesn't make a lot of sense to map the file, because typically what you're going to do, I mean, to map the file directly to GPU memory. Maybe it makes sense to map the file to just your own memory. But typically what you're going to do is expand the data out into GPU memory. You're going to read a smaller, more compressed chunk from your data file format and then decompress it into the GPU space. So again, the idea of flat mapping there doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense, right? Now, I think there have been, I'm trying to think now. I mean, AMD anyway had some virtual texturing stuff where they thunk through to pages on disk, and I can't remember how that stuff's implemented, you know, so there, like I said, there may be ways to map GPU pages to file pages. Like, that may be in the OS, and I just don't know. So I'm sorry, I really can't speak to it. You know, I can, like I said, I told you, I can tell you basically what would be required on the OS side, but I just don't know if anyone's implemented that. They may have, they may not have. Quickshift says, the main thing I'm concerned with is, since I've never really programmed in object-oriented programming, I can't be sure if I'm sometimes transitioning into OOP accidentally, and it really bugs me since you could say that device or texture structs are objects or stuff like that. Again, being religious about object-oriented programming is bad, and being religious about not using object-oriented programming is also bad in a sense. Meaning, it's not it's not like there's a programming god who's gonna like come down and smite you if you accidentally do one or the other, right? So the correct philosophical approach is just to say, look, if I'm going to make a decision, I should make it on something measurable, okay? And that is really all you need to remember. If you can't think of a reason why writing code way A or way B is better or worse, if you can't come up with a measurable thing, right, then it can't be that bad either way. Or it's past your current ability level to know. And, if something's past your current ability level, then it is. Everyone is constantly getting better at what they do, including me, including everyone else. And so you can only make the best decision as you can make at the time. I mean, that's just all we can ever expect of ourselves, is to do the best we could with the information we had. And would we like to all be smarter? Sure, but we can only be as smart as we are on that day, right? We can only have as much as we can have. So when you look at something and you go, is there a way to decide whether this thing is better or worse, right? You can usually suss out that just from looking at what the results are of doing it, and if you want to look at something object-oriented wise and you're like, I have an A or I have a B, and someone writes something like this, I don't know why these aren't shifted off here. That's where I think they normally go, but I don't know. I don't ever type those in anymore, so I couldn't tell you. So, if you're talking about this and then you're like, well, I have a choice between these two things, and, as a result, I've got a choice between these two things. And so in here, I'm just like, I would access this thing this way, and in here, I would do it, this way. Right? You can make assessments in an objective sense about these two things. The first thing I can say about it is there's no difference between the CPU code generated in either case, right? Meaning I know that this is going to increment this value by 1. So the only thing that I could really say is that, well, if the compiler was going to screw up the code gen for one of these, it would almost certainly be this one because there's a lot more involved, right? So, it's a slight negative mark on B because maybe the compiler occasionally gets this sort of thing wrong if we have too much of this happening. But otherwise, I know that there's no difference in the code speed really there in any other way, right? So then I just have to ask myself, well, if I wrote it this way and this way versus this way and this way, what are the practical differences to how much I have to type in and read? And, you can see the difference between these two things is massive, right? I mean, there's no question about which one you'd rather type in. This is way simpler. It's way easier to type, way easier to read, way smaller than this. It's a giant monstrosity, right? Even though there's no difference between these two things, right? Even if I want to have a new one, right? And we'll get to that in 1 second. So they're basically like the same kind of thing, right? And so in this case, I can say, well, what am I getting for all of this extra typing? And, you'd have to ask an object-oriented programmer what they're getting, because I see you getting nothing. If I want to go change how this stuff is happening, I can always just add, an underscore here and change and force everyone who's using it to call into some accessor later if I want to. So if I don't have any reason to do that, I shouldn't bother, because I'm just making everyone's code worse all the time by not doing that. And so usually the idea behind these, the argument made is that, well, you're kind of like planning for some future change that you might make, but basically what you're doing is forcing everyone to do all, a lot of object-oriented programming patterns are about forcing everyone else to do 100% of the typing they would ever have to do if you ended up changing everything about your program every time, rather than only forcing them to do the typing necessary for the things you actually end up doing. So this forces you to do all the typing for any change you might make in X ahead of time, and then if you never change X, well, you just wasted all your time and everyone else's time doing it, right? Whereas this does create typing in the case where you then need to make X be something that's an accessor based, but you only pay it when you actually do it, right? And so when you look at those two things, it's pretty easy to understand that difference. It's not very complicated. So it's pretty easy to say, well, why would I do this? Like, it's just lots of extra typing for no benefit, right? And so the reason why you pick one of these things is not because someone such as myself told you object-oriented programming was bad. It's because you should be able to do that analysis, right? And furthermore, you should be able to do the analysis of, if you knew ahead of time that X was going to change, then you should have made accessors for it, right? So you should be able to do that analysis, and if you're not doing that analysis, then me or anyone else telling you to or not do object-oriented programming really isn't helping. It's just cheating. And so you should spend your time figuring out how to get better at this kind of analysis rather than following my advice or someone else's, right? Now, I'll take this one step further and show you a place where a difference of opinion could arise and why you should be making decisions for yourself. There is one difference between these two. This one lets you initialize it in two ways, and this one only lets you initialize it in one way. So, for example, if I want to say, A here, it's different than A initialize. This one, B, that, is the same as that. There is no, I always will get a 0 initializer because it's got a constructor here, right? So there is only one way to initialize it, and the initialization is required, right? And so in some people's world, they're like, I want everything to always run a default constructor because I want this set to 0 to always happen, and I don't really want the person to ever be able to do anything else, right? And technically you can do something else, because if you want to, you could do something like this, where you basically make something the size of a B and then, put the B in there, right? So you can still go through a lot of gyrations to do it, but in my mind, I would rather just have the two simple ways of doing it, one that is the clear and one that is not the clear. And so I choose, because I prefer this ease of use and this paradigm, I choose this way of programming because I find it to be more efficient. Other people might not, and they would rather have a default constructor in there, so they should put that in there, right? And that to me is a less clear-cut win. I think I can make a strong argument for why this is better, but it's not the same as the a priori force everyone to use accessors thing, which I think is a pretty bad decision. Like I said, everything in object-oriented programming is like that, meaning every last thing you might choose to do is something that you don't want to just assume it's bad or good. You should look at it if it's the first time you've seen it and try to make an assessment about whether you think it is helpful or hurtful and in what circumstances. So some things you may say are always bad. Other things you may say are only sometimes bad and sometimes useful, right? And that way you can choose to use or not use them whenever you find that you're in a circumstance where they would be good, right? So Zero IZI. In the OOP example that you gave, you assume that you have access to the source code. That might be the case in Handmade Hero. But if you're using a library, you don't have sometimes access to the CPC sources. Another reason to use Unity build without libraries. Sorry, I'm not sure exactly which example you're referring to, so I can't really clarify much of that. You're right that OOP is bad when every single field of a class is a getter setter. However, in general, it is better to only have getters for most fields, making sure they can only be changed by the class itself. It's the same reason globals are generally to be avoided. State changing randomly makes code hard to follow. So I don't really agree with that. So I guess what I would say is I really tend to factor things more broadly than that. So the way I look at it is either someone should have access to a struct or they shouldn't. If they shouldn't have access to the struct, then the whole thing should be opaque, meaning they should not even be able to see the definition of the struct. It should look like this, right? Or if they can access the struct, then it shouldn't have getters and setters, generally speaking, right? And the reason for that is either I trust the person who's using this thing to know what they're doing with it, and it's generally the kind of thing where people are allowed to change the values in it, or it isn't. I don't usually find that mixing and matching those makes a lot of sense. So having getters for fields is usually, again, just a waste of typing for anything where I don't think there's a high risk of error. And then where I think there is a high risk of error, or I'm trying to ship like a strong library where I really want to be able to modify things behind the scenes, I go this route. So you don't get to see anything about it. You just get back a blind pointer, and any operation you do goes through me, right? So I tend to categorize those things more broadly, which is why you don't see me putting getters and setters on anything that's generally used inside that region. And so, again, I think that's really important, because what the OOP getter setter or just getter thing tends to encourage is walling things off too early. So rather than allowing this much code the ability to do that modification and drawing the wall out here, you tend to draw it in here, and then you just have tons of extra typing that wasn't necessary, because in reality, all of this code really kind of did need to know how those structs work. And then I agree that the people out here don't need to know, but those people maybe should never see the internals of that struct anyway, right? So that's how I would put that. Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap it up. There we go. All right, thank you everyone for joining me for the episode of Handmade Hero. It's been a pleasure coding with you as always. If you would like to follow along the series at home, you can always order the game, pre-order the game on handmadehero.org. It comes with the source code, so you can follow along with it at home. We will be back for another surprise stream sometime. I don't really know exactly when, but keep your eyes peeled because we are still celebrating Krampuslauf, which I believe is officially today, but we've been sort of having 2 or 3 weeks of celebration there. Let's find out. So it's maybe, yeah, I don't know. I don't know when it actually happens. The 6th of December? Yeah, okay. So on the preceding evening, December 5th, so it's tonight, the hairy devil appears on the streets, sometimes accompanying St. Nicholas and sometimes on his own. He will visit homes and businesses, or it. I don't know if is it a he or an it? on his own. So I guess it's a he. The saint usually appears in the eastern rite vestments of a bishop, and he carries a golden ceremonial staff. That is not a vestment of a bishop, but I guess that's just sometimes. Unlike North American versions of Santa Claus in these... Oh, the saint does, not Krampus. Never mind. So never mind. That's Santa Claus, or Saint Nicholas, if you will. Concerns only with good children, while Krampus is responsible for the bad. Nicholas advances gifts, while Krampus supplies coal and Ruten bundles. I don't know what those are. Krampusruten. So there we go. So there's Krampusruten. And, you know, there you go. See, he's got it. There's the little kids in the back. Just quality fun for the whole family. Kronfaslauf, highly recommended. So have a good Kronfaslauf this evening. We'll be back tomorrow for some more post-Kronfaslauf revelry. Until then, have fun programming. I'll see everyone on the internet.